In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at setting up a nature scene with the focus on learning to use the basics of geometry nodes. In this first video, we'll focus on scene setup for those newer to Blender who want to learn some basics about vertex weight maps, sculpting, and collections setup. We'll also create an important and easy to understand geometry node setup to help make a very dense scene manageable. In the second video, we'll focus on a very useful geometry node setup for scattering objects on a surface. This will include various controls to customize it. It's a great setup for learning what geometry nodes are capable of. So the first thing that we need to do in this video is set up what I'm calling the scattering terrain. The second section is about preparing geometry that will be scattered on the terrain. These items are the rocks, the trees, etc. And the third section is working with the geometry nodes themselves. Section 1 deals with creating the scattering terrain object, or mesh, and it's broken down into 3 subsections. Just to give you a sense of the scale, we're going to set something up in meters that's about 1.5 acres by 1.5 acres in size. So we need to actually create the geometry that we want to function as the land. I've already got a piece of geometry in the file that's going to function as the pond water. When I create this, it creates at the center of our 3D universe here, and I've got it set to 108 meters. It's about 1.5 acres. Tab key goes into edit mode, and we need to subdivide this. Let's take it up to the maximum subdivs we can give of 100. And then let's do it one more time, do subdivide one more time of just a value of 1 to double that up. So this is going to be our sculpting resolution. This is going to be what we need to generally sculpt to form just the basics of our land. So I want to move this up just a little bit. In fact, let's bring up the pond water object. And I want to take our land and I want to move this up above it. And this will make sense here in just a minute. Let's come over here now. And you see I've got a collection called emitters, and I'm going to move this in. So let's come in now and call this forest ground. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time because sculpting isn't the focus of this tutorial, but I do want you to see the general process if you're kind of new to this. So let's come over here into sculpt mode. And the first thing that we want to do is just, if you right click, then you can set the parameters like the radius and the strength. For instance, we'll just go ahead and use the default values. And you're going to note down here, I'm in Blender 4.3, we've got blob. And if we just come over and start painting, you can kind of see the effect that that has. In fact, let's undo and let's come over here into shaded mode. And you can see that that is what blob does. But since we want to sculpt down into it, you can do the inverse by holding the control key and then we go down. So let's just do this. Let's just hack out an area that we want to be sort of where the water is, the pond. And the reason that we came in and added this water plane underneath is because I basically kind of wanted to see where my water started to appear. So I'm holding the control key down again. And as I sculpt down, the water begins to appear, and this will be my basic shoreline. So this is basically the process. You can sculpt some inlets over here and just do something that gets you the basic water form that you like. And in fact, I'm going to come out over here just a little bit because I'm going to release the control key so I go back into a positive, and then I can sculpt an island right there in the middle. So let's say that you've gotten the water for your pond okay. Now let's just come back over and begin sculpting the rest of the landform. So this is where, again, I can hold the control key down and I can just paint around. In fact, if it's too strong, you can take the strength down, control key. So I want to kind of just form a little bit around like that, just taking down some of, so it has a little bit more like a shoreline coming in, areas like that. And if you want to smooth it out at any point, hold the shift key and that will automatically put you into a smooth mode to see how you can smooth out what you're doing. Let's come in and increase the radius. Since I'm not holding the control key down and I'm still over here in blob, now I can come in and just begin painting sort of the outer areas, like there are hills around where I have my pond. So you can just play around with stuff like this and get that going up. Get some nice sort of surrounding hillside. And if you want to depress it, hold the control key and then you can bring some of that down like that. Again, this isn't super critical, but this is more about what the process is that I've been using. So I've gotten the basic form in. In fact, I think this bar right here, I'm gonna kind of remove that. Okay, so you've done all the forming work, but we want to double check to make sure that our pond is deep enough. And I'm kind of looking at this plane that I'm using as my water level, and I'd kind of like the pond to go a little bit deeper. So Option Z, so we can go into X-ray, and then I'm just going to come in and hold the control key down so I can go in the negative. And in fact, I need to bring strength back up and then control key, and I can depress the area that I'm wanting for the water here to be just a little bit deeper. So when we come down and we look, we can see that that goes deeper. So it doesn't need to be anything specific, just something about like that. Not all parts of the pond are going to be as equally deep as the other. And I think that's good for what we need it to be as far as having basic geometry for our land. Let's leave edit mode, come back into object mode. Let's turn on shade smooth, and let's now come in and add a subdivision modifier. In fact, let's come back over to wireframe so that we can see exactly what we're doing with our geometry. We want to have just one more level. Let's add subdivision now, and if we turn off optimal display, we can see the actual distribution of final polygons that we'll be using here. And that's going to be good because we want to add just a little bit of extra detail that we don't want to waste time sculpting, that we can add procedurally. So let's come down here, let's collapse subdivision, and we'll add one more modifier to this. We'll come down to deform, and then we're going to do displace. Blender has a couple of ways of doing displacement, and this one happens to work really well because it's not bound to any one particular material. So let's do this. Let's come in and realize that we've added displacement, but we haven't given it really anything apart from a single value to displace. So we need to give it a new source for displacing. And when you click this, it's going to give us a few more options here. Now, I'm going to tell you, this is a little bit confusing the way the user interface is set up here. Where it says texture here, we just created that. We'll call this land detail, just something clever like that. And this little icon right here, the little checker box, refers down here to texture properties, but there's another icon right over here. This also will take us down into this area to edit the land detail that we've just created. So click that. You can see it says land detail. Now be careful. If this is collapsed down, sometimes you won't see that you have more options up top, and that can kind of get you confused. So we need to come down and change the type from image or a movie, a bitmap based, and we want to, let's use Musgrave. That's a good one. And it's procedural, and you'll get something like that. So we need to make a couple of changes to parameters, and obviously the first one is the spikiness. So let's come over to intensity and take this down to 0.25. Well, that helps, but the detail, the size, what we're calling size here, is way too small. So let's take this up to 1. That gives us bumpiness. That's certainly helping, but I think maybe for size, if we go to something like 2, well, that's better. And then for intensity, you can continue to maybe take this down just a little bit like that. But let's come over here and take a look at how it's actually shifting this from the source mesh that we have. So we need to jump back over to the modifier, the displacement modifier here, and we're going to take a look at this mid-level value. In fact, we want to come over here and turn on the edit mode so that we can see the displacement when we come into edit mode. So we see that, and you see that we have the original mesh, and then we have the displacement. And so what's happening is the displacement is being split evenly. So the displacement has a value of 0, which is no effect on displacement, up to 1. Think of it like white, which is full displacement, and we're having our mid-level being at a value in between. But I want it to be so that our base mesh is at the black level. So we take this down and we move that so that the base mesh sits basically at the bottom of the displacement. That's how I tend to like to work, at least in this situation. So let's go ahead and leave edit mode. And then you can come back and make any kind of tweaks or changes that you want. But I just think as far as the size of the land, this probably works pretty well. So the final thing that we need to do is to paint in some vertex maps to tell our distributed geometry where they belong and where they don't belong, essentially. So let's go ahead and collapse displace here, and let's come down to our data properties, and let's create a new vertex map. We're going to call this water area. So we're going to be putting a whole bunch of trees and grass and flowers and rocks and things like that we don't want to be underneath the water, and we need to paint that. We also don't necessarily want them to maybe come right exactly to the edge of the water, so we'll have a little bit of bleed into the land area. So we're going to come over now here into weight paint. This is where we will come in and make sure that our radius is a little bit smaller, and we're just going to begin painting across the perimeter, just like this, of our land area to demarcate land and water to give us a little bit of bleed. And so we're just going to do this. We're just going to come all the way around. And don't worry if it's not exact. This is by no means anything about perfection because, nature's not going to be perfect. Let's come around over here. Let's do sort of the same thing. Come in about like that. We just want to demarcate land from water. Now, let's go into X-ray mode here, and we can see that this is still blue, which means we're going to get a distribution of those things from the land into that area, and we don't want that. But so now I want to get rid of this. For some reason that painted. So hold the control key down and that will put us into erase mode. Let's come up here to our modifier stack and let's just disable subdivision temporarily, and this will make the painting go just a little bit faster. Back down here in data object properties, we want to duplicate this because I actually want this perimeter all by itself too, because we'll end up distributing rocks and things just along the perimeter of the water. So let's come over here and do a duplicate vertex group, and we'll call this water edge. Now let's come back up here to water area, and let's bring in a much larger brush, and then we can just begin painting in, and you just want to paint in all of the area. Somebody can tell me if there's a way of filling. There probably is, I just don't know it. And we'll paint in the water area, so none of our trees and rocks and things that live with those belong in this area underwater. Okay, so we've got the last little bit there, and don't worry if it changes the perimeter a little bit. You can always go back and even way downstream, and you can adjust these. Okay, so we've gotten this. And you just check to make sure it's mostly red. If it's just slightly orange or moved into this blue area, every now and then a tree will end up down there, and you can paint that out later. Okay, there we go. Now that we're done, let's leave weight paint mode. We can look at our creation. In fact, I think I want to come over here and maybe for displacement, just change the scale a little bit so those small detail bumps are just a little bit larger. Yeah, that works for me. So let's turn our attention away from the emitting geometry, and we're going to come over and look at our nature objects. So we need to turn them on. You can see already turning on the trees is causing a bit of a performance issue, something that we have to deal with. So I sourced my geometry from a couple different locations. I bought the light version of Botanic, which has some trees and grass and other objects like rocks. Polyhaven is a fantastic source trees. This tree is from Polyhaven and it's generated by geometry nodes and it's really, really high quality. Rocks, some plants, things like that. And then you need to organize them in a particular way so that they function correctly when they're distributed across the surface. So let's take a look at the trees first. I'm using 3 trees for my forest, and each of these 3 trees is in a collection within the main tree collection. And when we expand this out, we can see all the components. There are either 2 or 3 items. When the trees came to me, they were in a single item that just had multiple materials, material for the leaves, material for the trunk and branches, etc. But when I distributed these across the surface, it quickly got to the point where the viewport was unusable. It just trying to draw 100 trees across the surface or 1,000 trees was too slow. So this is where we're going to use geometry nodes to help, but we just need to understand from a distribution standpoint that we're going to reference a collection. And we want to make sure that each of our 3 trees sit within this primary collection called trees that we're going to reference. And as long as all the subcomponents that I have here are within a sub-collection, this will be treated as a single tree instance inside the geometry node. Okay, so that's kind of how this works. But of interest, you may ask, well, if it came to me, why go ahead and separate these? Because I've separated the leaves from the trunk. And again, it's the performance issue thing. So I just selected the small branches and leaves and separated them to become their own object. And we'll take a look at that in just a minute, what I did with geometry nodes. But let's come down to the flowers, because the flowers are different. In fact, let's come over and take a look at the smaller rocks. The smaller rocks, we don't need to do anything because we have a primary collection that we're going to use inside a geometry node for distribution. And they're just single items sitting within inside at the first hierarchical level of this collection. So that's good. And it's the same with the grass. When we take a look at our 3 grass objects, it's just 3 grass objects that can be used by the emitting surface. But when we take a look at our flowers, I've got multiple flowers here. Well, that's a little bit of a different story because these are not components of a single flower. They're individual flower units that we want to be distributed across the surface in sort of a random way. So we have to deal with these as a little bit of a separate condition. So I could dump all of these into just the flowers collection, so they all exist at the same hierarchical level, much like the 3 grass objects were at one level, but I'd really like to maintain them in an organized collection structure. So what we need to do is select flowers, create a new collection, and we'll call this flowers.instances. And then we'll take all of our flowers themselves, press Option D, which is duplicate linked, press the escape key, and then we're just going to grab these and move these into that new instance. So the node will reference these, and these are all just instances that link back to the organized collection structure that we have up here. So let's close down our flowers and let's take a look at the larger rocks. Let's go ahead and select everything and we'll take a look at these, and we want to look at the native polygon resolution, so we'll just go into a basic wireframe. We can see it's fairly dense, and as soon as we start trying to distribute thousands of these across the surface, it's going to bog the display down quite heavily. So this is where we jump in and we begin using geometry nodes as a way of helping us deal with that. So let's bring up our geometry node editor panel here, and we've got our modifier stack. Geometry nodes is just a modifier that gets added to the stack, and we want to come in and create a new one, which you can see appear down here. Let's zoom in just to the one that we're editing, and we've got an input and an output. And the input is the geometry as it currently exists, and nothing is happening, and so it outputs the same geometry for the display. And what we want to do is figure out a geometry node that will allow it to display at a lower resolution for interactivity purposes, but the setup will recognize if it's going to the render engine, and then we'll use the high resolution native geometry. So we bring up the context menu here, Shift A, and we're going to type in viewport, and there is an is viewport node. And this is going to be the condition that detects whether it's in the viewport or going to the render. Then Shift A, and we're going to type in switch, and this node we're going to put right up beside it. It drives me nuts when it tries to connect things when you don't want it to do that. Okay, and then at the bottom we need a third node called a convex hull, which we're going to put right here. So let's think about what we want to do. Is viewport is the condition. So let's drive this over here into the switch. That is the switch condition. If this is true, that we're in an interactive viewport display, then we need to drive the group input into convex hull, and then this becomes the true condition for the geometry, and that drives here into the group output. Okay, and look at that. It puts a basic stripped down version of the geometry that's much faster to display than the native geometry. But if the condition is that it's going to the render engine, it's not being in the viewport, so the condition becomes false. And then we simply use the geometry as it natively is. And then this will allow us to switch between being in viewport, which uses the convex hull low resolution for display purposes, but if it's rendering, it goes to the original geometry and passes that on for render purposes. So this is going to be very useful for us. So let's come over here and name this. We'll call this convex hull node so we can reutilize that. And then we just come over and we can assign this to the other ones. So if we start here, we just click new, and then we can convex hull, and just you can quickly assign to each of these convex hull, and then each of these receives that. And believe me, these will display much, much faster. We've got a little dinky one right there, convex hull. So let's go ahead and jump over and take a look at the trees, because this is really going to benefit the trees significantly. You can see all the geometry even makes turning on the trees a little bit slow. So let's start up here with the first one. Shift S, and we'll just bring that into view. Now this is why I took the time to separate the leaves and the small branches from the trunk, so that I can come over and turn on. Let's come here and take a look. I've already got a geometry node here in the modifier stack, so I'm going to assign it the convex hull. And then look at that. It just surrounds the complexity of those trees with a shape that's in the shape of the tree, but far less geometry. But I can still see the trunk itself and the basic branches. So for posing purposes, when I have the camera sitting there, I can kind of see what the tree is doing. So let's do the same thing with this one over here. So let's open that up. So I've got trunk and leaves. And so let's assign to the leaves the convex hull, and that is much faster. Now this one is a little bit different. This one is a geometry node setup, and I would need to integrate this into this very complex geometry node setup that somebody else did. So I have this one set up in a little bit of a different way. Let's come down and take a look at this setup where the leaves are separated from the trunk. The trunk is a separate entity. So what we're going to do with the leaves is we're just simply going to make it so that the leaves are turned off. And I have made sure that the disable in viewport and the hide in viewport, I know that's confusing, both of those are active so that those are turned off, but I can still see it still renders, and I can see the trunk itself. And so that's just the way I've had to handle this one. I didn't want to try and integrate a node's snippet of code into a very complex setup that somebody has else generated. It's a beautiful tree model though. So This is much, much faster. And then we would just need to come in and do the same thing to, let's say, the flowers. So we could do this to each and every one of our flower models. And so once again, having 1,000 of these, 10,000 of these, whatever in the scene would be really painful. So we'll just quickly add Convex Hull to each one of these, and it's good enough to get a sense for how these are distributed across the scene. And it will display far, far, far faster. Okay, so that is basically the setup. Now we could do the same thing for the grass. We're not going to go through that because it's the same process. So we have rocks, the trees, and the grass, and the flowers now prepared to be distributed onto our emitting surface using a more complex geometry node setup that we're going to tackle next.